I am always inspired when I read the biography of missionaries, and one of my favorites is the story of Adoniram Judson. He is considered to be America's first foreign missionary, so the first person that America sent to a different country to be a missionary was Adoniram Judson. This is in the early 1800s. He was 24 years old when he decided that he was going to set sail here from America, go to India, and then from India end up in Burma, where he would share the gospel and tell people about Jesus. But Burma was considered to be a very hostile environment to faith. There were no known missionaries from any country in Burma at the time. But he felt like that's where God was calling him to go. And he was in love with this young lady named Anne. Anne was 23 years old. And so what Adoniram wanted to do was to marry her and then take her to Burma. That was going to be part of the deal. And before he took her, before he got married to her, he sent her father a letter asking for his permission. And I want to read to you the letter he wrote to her dad. He says, "I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death." Like when I asked my father-in-law for my wife's hand in marriage, it was at Pizza Hut. So, little different. He says, "Can you consent to all of this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you? Will you consent to all of this for the sake of the perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all of this in hopes of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with the crown of righteousness?" Her father responded, "She can make up her own mind." And so in 1813, they were married and they set sail to Burma, and they experienced one hardship after another. And it turns out that the letter he wrote to his would-be father-in-law was much more prophetic than he realized at the time. In 1824, Adoniram was put in prison. He was in prison for 18 months, and while he was in prison, he wasted away. It was unrecognizable, hollow eyes, just rags for clothes. He was nearly crippled from the torture. While he was in prison, he found out that his wife was expecting their baby. And at night, Adoniram would have his feet tied together, and then the jailer would hoist his feet up into the air so that only the back of his shoulders and the back of his head would be resting on the ground. That's how he would sleep, often in 110 plus degrees. Mosquitoes eating him alive. And now his wife's pregnant, and she would walk 2 miles every day to plead that Judson could be released. And he was dying. While he was in prison, his daughter Maria was born, but then Anne became sick, and she was as sick and thin as Adoniram, and her milk had dried up, and the jailer eventually had mercy on them, and for a number of months he actually let Judson out of prison each evening for a few hours so that he could take their baby into the nearby village and beg for other nursing mothers to nurse his baby. Eventually, he was released from prison just in time to watch his wife die. And 6 months later, his daughter Maria died as well. He would remarry, and his second wife would die on the mission field as well. He would bury 7 children in Burma before he died at age 61. So we're continuing in a series called Get Over Yourself. And sometimes what we need to get over ourselves is a little perspective. And there's this tendency when we talk about a theme like get over yourself that we want to do so apologetically, and we don't want to offend anybody. And hey, we know it's a lot to ask when we talk about giving or serving. And then you hear stories like this and you realize we got a little ways to go. Right? It's a humbling thing to preach this sermon after reading that story. And yet, the challenge for us is to get over ourselves. It is to understand that the point of this life is not our own temporary pleasure and happiness and success, but there's so much more at stake here than we realize. And so in this series, we're taking a look at just a few paragraphs in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and we're understanding that these words in particular have a lot of relevance to the world we live in. Ephesus had a lot of parallels to our Western world. And so Paul's writing to Timothy, who's a church leader in Ephesus, and Paul's telling Timothy, you make sure to tell these people these things about living out their faith in the world where they are. And we've just said that a lot of these things require you to get over yourself. And if you're gonna get over yourself, it means that you're gonna stop looking at life and relationships and money and decisions through this lens of what is temporary, and you're gonna start looking at life through the lens of eternity. You're gonna start having a perspective that is influenced by your eternal destination, not just your temporary pleasure, temporary comfort and convenience. See, when you start looking at life through the lens of eternity, then what Adoniram and Ann Judson did doesn't seem so crazy. In fact, it seems to make some sense. I mean, if this world is just a mist, as the Bible says, if it's just a moment and it appears for a little while and then it's gone, then what they did makes sense. Now, a lot of us hear a story like that and it's just instinctive. We cannot help but just feel sorry for them. We can't help but just, we start to think about everything they gave up. And Anne, she had counted the cost of what she was giving up. She wasn't going into it blindly. In fact, while she was processing the decision of whether or not she would go, she wrote a letter to her best friend, Lydia Kimball, trying to think through her decision. And here's what Anne wrote. We have a part of that letter. She said, I feel willing and expect, if nothing in providence prevents, to spend my days in this world in heathen lands. Yes, Lydia, I have about come to the determination to give up all my comforts and enjoyments here and sacrifice my affection for relatives and friends and go where God in his providence shall see fit to place me. She knew what she was doing. She's giving up comforts and conveniences and relationships. Like she was saying goodbye to her family, and that was gonna be it. I mean, you take a journey like that, it's a one-way ticket. There were no planes. You didn't come back on the holidays for furlough. There was no Skype or FaceTime or no cell phones. She was saying goodbye. But she knew what she was doing. And you can sit here and you can feel sorry for her and everything that she went through, and maybe that's how her family felt when they heard the news, but she doesn't feel sorry for herself. If she were here today, you know who she'd feel sorry for? She'd feel sorry for you. She'd feel sorry for me, because we get caught up in the temporary trappings of this world, and we come and we sit in our comfortable seats, and the hardest thing we're gonna go through today is sitting in traffic a little longer than we think we should, and there should be a better system and a better way for it, and why can't they do something about this? And then we go home and we eat and we rest and we take care of a few chores around the house, and we feel sorry for her. I think she feels sorry for you and for me. Because in light of eternity, she's not regretting the investment she made. In light of what she has received in heaven, she doesn't have regrets about that. And my guess is that she would look back on the life that a lot of us live and compare it to hers, and she'd feel sorry for us. It's a good investment when you live your life with eternity in mind. And Jesus uses kind of a rate of return metaphor or example to help us see how true this is. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 20, Jesus said, everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. Jesus said, look, the point of this life is to prepare for the next. That's it. Like you're not sure why you're here, you're not sure what the purpose of life is, and the point of this life is to prepare for the next. And Jesus said, those who sacrifice, those who don't live for themselves, but live for me and live for my kingdom, there's this 10,000% rate of return that awaits. That when we live life with eternity in mind, we're making a good we're making a good investment. And Paul says to Timothy, you make sure you remind the people who are wealthy in this world to be intentional when it comes to their heavenly portfolios. And so in 1 Timothy 6, we've looked at a couple of these paragraphs, and he's gonna challenge Timothy to challenge these Christians. Don't get too caught up in the conveniences and the comforts of this life. And Ephesus, it was more developed than you might think. The wealthy people in Ephesus had indoor plumbing. They had even figured out a way to have hot and cold water. And Paul says, don't think that your life is going to be defined by whether or not you end up with indoor plumbing, whether or not you have the double shower head. Don't think that if you just could go on this vacation, or you could drive this kind of car, or you could live in this kind of home, that's somehow going to bring purpose and meaning to your life. Don't look at life through the lens of temporary comforts and conveniences. Now, this is really hard, because if you just start paying attention to the advertisements and how all of them leverage this desire we have to be comfort, to have convenience, and to have it right now. Like, we are surrounded by that message. We are surrounded by those advertisements. And so Paul's going to challenge Christians here to be intentional, to look at life through this lens of eternity. And here's what he says, starting verse 18. He says, tell them to use their money to do good. To use their money. They should be rich in good works and generous to others in need, and they always need to be ready to share with others. By doing this, they will be storing up their treasures as a good foundation for the future. He's speaking here of heaven, so that they may experience true life. So in verse 17, Paul had said, look, don't put your hope in money. It's temporary. It's gone here today, gone tomorrow. Instead, use your money to invest in something that will last. And he gives three things. He said, first, do good to others. So you're not just writing a check, but you're demonstrating love. You're demonstrating kindness, compassion. And then he says to be generous to those in need. That's the intentional sacrificial giving that we've talked about. And he says, be ready to share with others. And this is just an open-handed approach to life, where in the course of a day, you don't know what opportunities you're gonna have to be generous, but you're gonna have some, and your spirit is gonna be an open-handed spirit, that if you can, then you will. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus gives us a parable that unpacks this a little bit. So if you're in 1 Timothy 6, flip back to the Gospel of Luke chapter 12. These are parallel passages, but Jesus, with this story, helps us apply it. He helps us put some skin on it and see what it looks like when we live this out. So here's the context in Luke 12. Jesus has been teaching, and it's pretty hardcore, Luke 12 is. You've got Jesus saying things, hey, don't worry about what men think of you, because they don't have the power to throw you into hell. Yeah, don't get too caught up if some people don't like you on social media. Don't let that ruin your day. Don't be so preoccupied with whether or not everyone agrees with you. Don't worry so much if you don't get the respect you deserve, or you're not honored the way you think you should be. You go through this life and people may not treat you fairly, and they might think ill of you, but Jesus is gonna say, hey, you know who you should be thinking about? Verse 5 is you should probably be thinking about God and what he thinks, because he has the power to throw you into hell. And so he's helping the people look at life through this lens of eternity. Don't get so caught up in impressing the people around you and kind of putting up this facade of your life and how great it is that you forget about God. And so someone in the crowd's been hearing this teaching. I don't know if he's not paying attention. It seems that he just kind of interrupts the teaching of Jesus on eternity with this question. Luke 12, verse 13, it says, someone in the crowd said to Jesus, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. So Jesus is teaching on eternity, but this guy's got a question about something pretty temporary. Jesus, tell my brother to give me my share of the inheritance. So what you probably have here is the younger brother, right? It's the younger brother, and he doesn't think he's being treated fairly, and why can't he have what his older brother got? And his parents are always doing these things for him, and why don't they do that? Why don't they do that the same way? And the Levitical law allowed for the oldest brother to get 2/3 of the inheritance, and the younger brother would get 1/3 in a situation presumably like this one. Now, that was the official law, but oftentimes it would be dealt with a little bit more evenly, right? So I'm guessing that's some kind of scenario that we're reading here where the younger brother probably got some, but thinks he should be dealt with a little bit more equitably. And so he says to Jesus, hey, tell my brother to do this. So he comes to Jesus, and you think he's asking a question about money. He's not. He's telling Jesus to agree with what he already thinks about money. And this is how most of us approach money and Jesus. We open up the Bible, and not so much with this open mind or soft heart to what God might want to teach us, but with this agenda. We say, God, I want to make sure you agree with me on this. It's true with every area of life, really. We have a tendency to approach God's word or approach Jesus, and we just want to make sure Jesus is on our side. Hey, Jesus, could you just sign off on this here? Could you just go ahead and justify my selfishness? We want Jesus to agree with us. And this guy has lost some perspective, right? Like he's putting the inheritance above the conversation that Jesus is trying to have over eternity and likely above his relationship with his brother. I see this a lot as a pastor in working with families when a loved one dies. And so I'm a part of the funeral, and I find out, it's whispered to me, hey, the siblings over here they're not really talking to each other. There's some conflict going on. Well, that's sad. They've just lost their mother, and the siblings aren't talking to each other. What's going on? Well, there was a 1997 Oldsmobile, and there's some disagreement over who should get that car. The 1997 Oldsmobile? Yeah, they're not talking to each other at the funeral of their mother because they don't think it's fair that one of them is driving a 1997 Oldsmobile that they would never drive if they had the opportunity. But because they didn't have the opportunity, they've got a problem with it. It's not the Oldsmobile, Kyle. It's the principle of the matter. Oh, please. Right, but that's what we do. We start looking at life, and it gets messed up. We start prioritizing the wrong things and putting the emphasis on the wrong areas, and relationships take a back seat to money and possessions. And so Jesus says to this man, he says, well, man, who am I to be the judge or arbitrator between you? And then Jesus turns to the crowd. He's going to turn this into a teachable moment, verse 16. And he told the crowd this parable. The ground of a certain rich man provided a good crop, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. So you got a guy who's rich, already rich, but now he has more than he really knows what to do with. He's not sure how to handle that wealth. And so he weighs his options. Verse 18, he makes this decision. Here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I'll say to myself, self, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. One of the ways you know you need to get over yourself is that you're having conversations with yourself about how prosperous you are and what you should do with all your prosperity, right? That's what you have here. This guy refers to himself 9 times in 2 verses, and he speaks of my crops and my barns and my grain and my goods. It's all his. He's focused on the temporary, but he's focused on himself. And he asks himself, what should I do with all this extra? And he doesn't consult with God. He doesn't seem to consider the fact that there are other people he might be able to help. Instead, he thinks, what I could do is I could just rent out a bunch of storage space, and I'll just store my stuff there so later I can use that. And he says the purpose of life then is to take life easy, to eat, drink, and be merry. It's all about him, and it's all about just the temporary pleasure and comforts of this world. And God looks down from heaven, and he sees this man living for himself, and he has something to say about it, as you might guess. Verse 20, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And Jesus concludes the story this way. This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich toward God. And that's the problem here, right? It's not that this guy had extra. His problem wasn't that he was blessed with an abundant crop. It's that he wasn't rich toward God. He wasn't using what God had given him, his time, his resources, for an eternal purpose, but rather just his own temporary pleasure and comforts. And so Jesus says, this man's a fool because doesn't know it. He's made all these plans, but he's going to die tonight. I was reading about a former CEO of Gillette. His name is Coleman Mockler. He is thought of as a model leader, a humble man who's actively involved in his church. After graduating from Harvard Business School, he worked his way up the ladder to CEO. He took the company Gillette to new levels of success. After 16 years as CEO, he was at the top of the game, and so Forbes magazine told him they were going to be putting his picture on the cover of their magazine, celebrating his leadership and success. And on January 25th, 1991, he was sent an advanced copy of that magazine with his cover on the front of Forbes. And the artist had done a rendering of Mockler standing on top of a mountain, holding this giant razor above his head in this victorious pose. And when the magazine arrived, Mockler carried it back to his office, and the rest of the office had gotten wind that it had come in and that he had it, and so they began to applaud and to celebrate him. And I mean, he had worked hard for that moment. He'd fought off numerous hostile takeover bids. He had revolutionized a 75-year-old company. His personal stock had increased 50-fold in the past 16 years. He was expecting to retire soon. Everything was coming together. And then he walks into his office carrying a magazine with his picture on the cover, and he shuts the door and he falls to the ground. Within moments, he is dead of a massive heart attack. And I don't know a lot about his heavenly portfolio. I don't know if he was ready for that moment, but the point is, it is uncertain. That you don't know when it's going to come knocking at your door. You spend your whole life, as one person said, climbing the ladder. You don't want to find out that it was leaning against the wrong building.